Hi there, welcome to the stream. I think I am live at the moment. So we're going to watch a bit of Laura Kuenssberg today, that's the idea. I'm just going to do a bit of commentary over the top, so look forward to chatting with you as we go along.
A new world. Labour and the Conservatives were both hit hard by Nigel Farage's reform. How will they answer it? Zia Youssef, the chair of Reform's here for the first time. So is the Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, and Labour's Health Secretary, Wes Streeting. Lib Dem leader, Sir Ed Davey, joins us from Dorset, and 5 out of 5, the Greens' Adrian Ramsey, will be with us too. We'll put your thoughts to our 5 politicians this morning. But after all that talk, there's time for a bit of music. Movie star Jeff Goldblum's side has...
Yeah, we're not going to be watching that bit.
I was a bad student, I had some facility, but I didn't want to practice, and he would know that I didn't practice. But then he gave me a sheet of music after I did, Charney and different things. He gave me this piece of music. I just liked it.
And Queen of the Royal Watchers, Tina Brown, is here. We'll be talking to her about Prince Harry's emotional interview, along with stalwarts of the Labour movement, Christina McAnee, boss of the union Unison. And watching...
At least we've got a union person on there, although it is Unison.
Her old party, former Conservative Cabinet Minister Justine Greening. Morning. Let's start, as we always do, by what's making the headlines today. The Sunday Times splashes with comments from the chair of Reform, who's with us today, saying that the young need moral education. The Independent quotes none other...
As a former teacher, I just find that really kind of triggering. Because really, the whole education system is set up so that children do not learn about politics, because if they did, they would challenge the existing system, wouldn't they? Yeah, education is always a political battleground, but it's set up so that children do not engage with politics. That's kind of the whole purpose. If you think about how education is set up, it's all about getting people to conform to rules, getting people to do as instructed, getting people to obey authority. The whole purpose of education is already to make sure our young people conform to the status quo. And yet the right are always attacking education.
John Curtis, we'll hear from him in a bit on Labour's woes. The Sunday Telegraph says Badenoch will not chase Farage to the right. We'll ask her later. The Mail on Sunday, though, leads on the royal rift. And the Sunday Mirror looks ahead to the VE Day celebrations later in the week. And here at the BBC, we're reporting a moving story of 8 men who've been arrested today in a counter-terror plot investigation. So, a huge few days of news, a really big change in the political environment. Justine, watching on, do you think this is a seismic shift, as Nigel Farage claims, or is it just a moment of...
I just can't stand the way that our political journalists engage with this stuff. It's so blasé. Now, obviously, Kuenssberg is somebody that lives in London, and London's pretty isolated from all of this stuff, but it's just... The whole tone of this debate it always strikes me as being on a really weird register, because, of course, if Farage does come to power, the effect on the rest of us is going to be absolutely huge. Look, and I'm sure some people in the chat actively support Farage. I know from my comments in my videos that there are UKIP supporters and, Reform, it's difficult to keep track, isn't it? Reform supporters there. But, we're not sort of disinterested observers in this debate. This is real.
A bubble.
I think it is a big shift, actually. I certainly think for this version of the Conservative Party, that's now finished. And I think if it's to have any future, it will have to substantially reinvent itself. I don't see a way back.
Wow, you think the Tories are finished if they carry on this trajectory?
I think this version of the Conservative Party that we've seen over the best part of a decade, that has been trying to out-reform, I think that experiment is demonstrably failed.
Yeah, I actually agree with her. Boris Johnson was very successful in 2019, essentially doing what Reform are doing now. I think that if the Conservative Party are to benefit in the current political climate, it's about finding political space. Now, clearly in the current moment, there's space to the left of the Labour Party, and the Conservative Party survives when it is able to chameleon-like occupy space. And there is a one nation tradition of conservatism that is capable of moving actually to the left of Labour in present circumstances and occupying a position that could win them support by being radical on the left, while still being somewhat socially conservative on the right. Now you might say that's quite similar to what Reform are doing, but actually I think it could occupy that space far more authentically from a one nation tradition.
And the party has reached a literal dead end.
Wow. Christina, you've a part of the Labour movement, have watched the Labour Party for a long time. This was a grisly set of results for a party that just in July got a whopping majority. What are they getting wrong?
I think this is as people have said, it's a wake-up call for the party and time for a reset. And just talking in sound bites and rhetoric won't work anymore. People expect more from a Labour Party, especially those who voted for them, obviously, and they're not getting it at the moment. And they need to feel better about the world and about their own lives. And sadly, that's not been delivered so far.
So what would a reset look like for you?
So for me, a reset would look like, we keep being...
I mean, there's an irony here, right? Because the affiliated unions have really not been criticising Labour enough because they've got enough out of Labour so far from their perspective. The Employment Rights Bill is going through Parliament and there's been an increase to the minimum wage and so on and so forth. And so, the affiliated unions have really not been critical of Labour enough. But let's hear what she says.
Told the world has changed. I've heard senior politicians say this all the time. So they need to look at changing some of the policies that they so far have set for themselves. And one of the big ones for me would be relaxing the tight fiscal rules that they've set. That would give them a bit more flexibility in terms of where they could spend money.
Tina, you spend most of your time in the States today, and we've talked to you before about Donald Trump. When you look at what's happening with Nigel Farage, do you think there's a parallel there?
There are similarities, but there's also a lot of...
Sorry, I'm still getting to grips with how to do this. I was just filling up my water. Yeah, loosening the fiscal rules is absolutely going to be central to Labour being able to do what is needed, really. There's an overly cautious approach, which really goes back to Labour's anxiety about why they the Labour right perceive Labour to be unelectable. The trauma goes back to the 1992 election when Labour released a shadow budget and was attacked with the famous tax bombshell campaign by John Major's Conservatives. So there's an anxiety that Labour is going to be attacked by the right-wing press and by the Conservative Party if they loosen the purse strings. But if they don't do that, then they're not going to be able to deal with the massive social problems that have been a result of austerity since 2010 and exacerbated by the pandemic. We're not living in ordinary times. The public realm is bereft of funding, bereft of investment. We're falling behind our competitors. So the idea that you can just engage with the world as if it is 1997 again, a period of time when economic growth was around about 3% throughout Blair's time in power. There was money coming in. There are things that you could do in those circumstances. We're not living in those times. And so you need to loosen the purse strings and get the state doing things. And if you need some money, then you could deal with the fact that we're living in a very unequal society and actually start taxing the rich.
Differences. Obviously, Farage, like Trump, vivid personality, immigration, DEI, these are the things that it's very easy to say. I think the difference really now is we've now had 100 days of Trump, and we know that he's the king of chaos, and we know that all the jingoistic phrases and phrases like waste, fraud and abuse sound great. When you start finding that waste, fraud and abuse means that everybody's getting laid off in all these agencies, etc., across America, it doesn't feel so good anymore. And he's got the worst poll ratings of any president at 100 days in 80 years, which is quite extraordinary. So there is time to make it up.
OK, well, we'll see, because we'll talk to 5 different political parties today on the show. So it's going to be a busy one, with Reform triumphant, Labour and the Tories both bruised, and the Greens and the Lib Dems reasonably pleased with themselves. But what does the nation's favourite number cruncher, Professor Sir John Curtice, make of it all? As ever, we've given him just a minute.
Yeah, John Curtis is, whatever he says, I'm not going to preempt it, but John Curtis is going to be absolutely spot on because he always is.
Reform won most votes, most seats and most councils by a country mile. Never before has a party other than the Conservatives and Labour topped the local polls. The Conservative Party put in what was by far its worst local election performance ever. It lost 45% of its seats to Reform. Labour hoped to make gains, profiting from the Conservative fallback. Instead, its vote fell back more heavily than that of any previous newly elected government. At 32%, Reform's share of the vote was just as high in previously Labour-held.
Yeah, this is really important. What we're seeing now is unprecedented. I said this in my recent video, but there isn't a precedent for a government doing this badly in a local election at all, right? So what's happening to Labour is totally unprecedented. A newly elected government coming into power off the back of 14 years of abject failure by the Conservative Party, as seen through the eyes of the British public, but also in reality. It's astonishing, and it's a product of a lot of things, but it's partly a product of the fact they were never that popular in the first place. They were far too cautious in their strategy, as I've pointed out a number of times. But really what they've promised is change in a very nebulous way, but then what they've actually done in office is make people's lives worse by doing things that the Tories would do. And it's going to be really difficult to change that narrative. But what we're living through is totally unprecedented.
As it was in Conservative ones. In contrast, Liberal Democrats and the Greens managed to fend off Reform's challenge in their wards. The Liberal Democrats did little more than hold their share of the vote.
I got told off by a friend of mine in my recent video for not talking about the Green Party enough. There's a real threat to Labour in urban areas from the Green Party. So if you think about it in geographical terms, Reform are challenging in the north, the Lib Dems are going to be strong against the Tories in the south, and then the Green Party are going to be challenging Labour in urban areas. So really, it's coming from all directions. And so it's an existential threat to both parties, what's happening at the moment.
But the fall in Conservative support enabled them to make gains where they were the Conservatives' principal challenger.
Well, let's speak to one of the victors. The chair of Reform UK, Zia Youssef, is here for the first time. Welcome to the studio. We can show people also some pictures of you pacing up and down at the Runcorn by-election, those nervous few hours when it just did come down to 6 votes. Let's start, though, with one of the big promises.
I wonder if this guy's incredibly rich. I'm not au fait with technology enough to go off this screen right now, but I'm pretty sure that if I went onto the Wikipedia page for this guy, he's going to be probably a very wealthy man. Don't know, maybe privately educated, I don't know. That is what these people have in common. They don't have the interests of ordinary people in their hearts and in their minds. They are a new Conservative Party, essentially defending the status quo position, defending those who are already privileged and wealthy within our society. That is the reality. And they're doing a very good job of cosplaying as a party of the working class, but that is not what they are. They are very much a party of the establishment.
Made that you're going to cut waste in the councils that you now control. How much money do you think you're going to save by cutting equality, diversity and inclusion policies? You've talked a lot about that in the campaign. How much money do you think you'll save?
Well, Laura, this was a historic set of results. I think that's the first thing to say. It was a turquoise tidal wave. I think it's going to be looked back on as the most important set of local election results in British history. We won 32% of the vote share, 40%.
Well, he's posher sounding than me, isn't he?
Of the seats. We've taken control of 10 councils, 2 mayorships. And look, we're going to work really hard for those constituents because we have a clear mandate. And in terms of things like wasteful spending, look, the first thing to say is there
we go. Thank you. I knew chat would come through for me. He's a millionaire, obviously, right? Obviously, because the interests that Reform UK represent, it's the same as with Donald Trump, right? These people are not people who are coming into politics to represent the interests of the working class. They're cosplaying so that they can fundamentally reassert the interests of the establishment. That's what it's all about. The Conservative Party used to do this, right? Wrap themselves in the flag, pretend to represent the interests of the working class. Old Toryism was all about this. This is just a new version of it.
Assessment of how much can be saved is based entirely on trying to assess these freedom of information requests, and there's a limit to what you can do with that, candidly. What I will say is that even within those FOIs, we can see that Lancashire County Council saw fit to spend £500,000 on ergonomic chairs for its staff. Northamptonshire County Council spent 1.1...
And this is the thing, right? They're talking about local councils and cutting council budgets. Who is it that relies upon council services? It's not people like this. Local council budgets are spent on the poorest people in our society. This is a typical Conservative agenda, cutting back where it's going to affect people most. And to be frank, local councils have already had their budgets cut back so much during austerity. There's nothing left to cut. This is just an absurd pitch by the Reform Party.
£1 million handing out free vapes. Look, what people want at a local level is not the world. What they want is their bins collected at least once a week, at least ideally twice. They want potholes fixed in exchange for the millions of pounds that is being spent on it. And they don't want their council tax going up 10 to 30% because councils keep going bankrupt.
And
it's really clever, this, because actually those things are concerning to people. Potholes in this country are terrible. I mean, I don't know about where you live, but I don't even drive. I have to get lifts from people. But even I, as somebody that doesn't drive, understands that the basic fabric of our society is breaking down from underinvestment. Of course, potholes are a good example of that. So, leaning into that is really clever. But cutting back on the amount of money that you spend from local councils is not going to solve any of that.
Reform will deliver on those things.
And you know that the vast majority of council money goes on things that councils legally have to do, like special needs education for children, care for the most elderly and vulnerable in our society through social care. But I want to stick on this because you've made a lot of promises about saving money from waste, from equality, inclusion and diversion and diversity. We've had a question from Alan in Barnard Castle, County Durham, a council you now control. And he said the bins are collected on time, potholes aren't nearly a problem that they are in other counties. What exactly do you object to about equality and diversity and inclusion? What's the problem?
Well, look, so in places like County Durham, there is a lot of disaffection about local government. There was a ward in County Durham where Reform won 65% of the vote share from a standing start.
No one's disputing your success, but what's the objection to that kind?
The reason people are disaffected in the northeast of England is because they had their lives destroyed by Thatcherism, by the effect that Thatcherism had on the industrial base in those communities and on mining villages in those communities. New Labour disappointed, the Conservatives came in with austerity, and then this incoming government have not addressed the concerns that these people have had for generations. You've got to have a government that understands that the material conditions in these parts of the country have been neglected or made worse for years, and Starmer fundamentally doesn't get it. Instead, what the Starmer project did was parachute in members of Parliament like Luke Akehurst in Durham, somebody who's never lived in the constituency, to represent the interests of these important Labour heartlands. And you've got to understand that these people living in these safe seats, they've been taken for granted for decades. For the Labour Party, these people were always going to turn out because they'd have to. And that degree of contempt is going to catch up with you at some point.
Of thing that councils do, equality, diversity and inclusion policies.
Well, the objection is very simple. We believe all hiring should be merit-based and colour-blind, and the best person should get the job, regardless of any immutable characteristics or anything else. And DEI is the opposite of that. Look, ultimately, one has to choose between equality of opportunity or equality of outcome. And
equality of opportunity doesn't exist in a situation where you've got a society that is totally rigged in favour of the rich and powerful. I don't know where this guy went to school. I suspect he went to a private school. He's a very wealthy man. Clearly his children are going to have an advantage if he's a millionaire over other people's children. Now, that's got nothing to do with diversity and inclusion, but this narrative about equality of opportunity only serves to reinforce existing hierarchies within our society.
Going back to it, what constituents want, and the evidence for that is the overwhelming landslide victory Reform just won, is they want simple things like bins collected on time, while your viewer is saying there's not an issue there. We've spoken to many people. That's why we won a landslide, who are deeply unsatisfied at the way local government is run.
Yeah, and just to respond to that comment in the chat, the reason the Equality Act exists to protect people with what are called disabilities under that act is to promote equality, right? Because we want to have a society where people can access services and enter the workplace on equal terms. And so the law currently requires employers to provide reasonable adjustments so that people can access the workplace equally. If you get rid of all of that, you're going to create a society where we don't have equality in the workplace. So these things do matter, and we've fought very hard to have them. And of course, Reform are going to take them away.
Is that you've said you can save money by cutting waste in this area.
Sure.
And we've checked with some of the councils that you won. Lincolnshire County Council said they don't have any staff doing those kinds of jobs. Staffordshire County Council told us they don't have any staff doing those kinds of jobs.
With respect, Laura.
Let me finish. Nottinghamshire County Council says they employ one person doing that job. And you said throughout this campaign, by cutting that kind of waste, you can save people money on their council tax bills. If there's hardly anybody doing these jobs, you're not going to save any money.
So I spent quite a lot of time actually looking at these Freedom of Information requests. And what you find when they respond to them is they're very loyally and very precise in their language. It's like getting blood out of a stone. If you take Lincolnshire County Council, yes, they do not currently have somebody with the job title, DEI officer. They do spend considerable money on DEI initiatives, and they have other people who have basically that same job but under a different title, partly in response to the fact that they've been inundated by think tanks and activists putting in FOIs. What we are going to do, and this is our commitment to the British people, sure, we don't have a magic wand, but we will cut waste. You can hold us to that. We are going to send teams in, task forces. We'll be opening up applications shortly. We want the brightest and the best. If you've got experience in audit, if you've got experience...
I mean, the whole thing's just nonsense, isn't it? The reality of local councils is that the vast majority of money is being spent on social care for adults and children, and that has crowded out investment in the rest of the public realm as far as local councils are concerned, and that is a product of austerity because all of the money that was going to local councils got cut and hasn't been replaced because it was an easy area to cut. So you don't have a lot more to cut, and there's a real crisis in local councils caused by those sorts of decisions. So this is tinkering around the edges. It's not serious as a political analysis of what's gone on, but that doesn't matter.
Fixing potholes. If you're a software engineer, we're going to bring task forces in. We're now going to have access to the contract, access to the numbers, access to payroll, and we're going to make these changes. And once we have done that analysis, we will share it with the British people.
So you'll come back and tell us how much money you think you can save.
Absolutely.
But at the moment, you don't know. Let's talk about another kind of contract. Nigel Farage and other Reform UK politicians have said that you will reject migrants going to areas that you now control. How on earth can you do that when migrants get sent to go and live in hotels because of contracts between the Home Office nationally and 3 big providers? So how will you actually do that? Because, again, we've checked this. The break clauses for these contracts is not till 2029. So aren't you promising something you can't deliver?
This aside, again, the whole reason that we have to house asylum seekers in hotels is because of decisions made by the Thatcher government to sell off all of the council housing. And, of course, Labour and subsequent Conservative governments failing to build council housing, continuing to allow council housing to be sold off. So we don't have the infrastructure to house anybody in this country because it was all sold off in order to fund very short-term policies in the Thatcher era and beyond.
Nigel promised. Look, so we are realistic about the fact that, yes, we won an overwhelming victory yesterday, but the levers of power at local level pale in comparison to the levers of power in Westminster. That's why this is part of a journey to making Nigel the Prime Minister with a Reform majority. However, what our commitment is to our constituents and the people who voted for us, this is our mandate. those levers of power will be pulled with all of our might by reform councils. We'll use every instrument of power available to us to stop it. And there are things you can do. There are judicial reviews. There are injunctions. There's a lot of different things that can be done. Things around planning, around budget allocation
but you've
as
told
well.
people on a specific point, and people care a lot about having asylum hotels in their communities. This has caused a lot of concern to many people. But you've told them that you will reject migrants going from the council areas that you now control. How will you actually do that? Because the contracts to house those people are between the Home Office and accommodation providers. You don't have the power, perhaps, to keep the promise that you've made.
It's important to understand here, because the context is never given when this is discussed on television. Britain takes a very small proportion of asylum seekers. These people are disproportionately people who are fleeing war and persecution in their own countries. The overwhelming majority are accepted as genuine asylum seekers. So there's just compassion missing from this debate. We do have very high levels of immigration in the UK, net migration, but that's not due to asylum seekers. Asylum seeking numbers are very low. And we owe a duty to those people to provide refuge from what they are suffering from. And we recognise that in some contexts, right? So we recognise it when it's a Ukrainian, and for some reason we don't seem to recognise it when it's people fleeing from other wars around the world.
Instruments of power available to us.
Well, like what?
Judicial reviews, injunctions. There's planning laws. You know, a lot of these hotels, and there has been litigation around this already. A lot of these hotels, when you suddenly turn them into something else, which is essentially a hostel, that falls foul of a number of regulations, and that's what our teams of lawyers are exploring at the moment. And we can look at budgets as well. So the word we used was resist. Look, we're not in government yet. That's our plan, and that's why people watching this programme who believe in these values, who don't want to live around people whose first action upon coming to this country was to break our laws and then to live at the behest of taxpayer money.
But the question here is the difference between saying things and doing things. Yeah. And you will be in office now in local government in much of England, and you've told people publicly that you will resist migrants coming to their communities. Yeah. But you don't have the direct power to do anything about it. Are you saying Reform's lawyers will try to use the courts to close asylum hotels? I'm trying to understand what you'll actually do.
There are a number of instruments at our disposal, which our teams are working. We've only just won the election, right? So what we're going to be doing...
It's just so disgusting how this whole debate works. I do think you've got to have some level of control over migration. Everybody thinks that, you can't have unlimited numbers of people coming into the country. But a lot of the migration that we see is actually beneficial to the UK. And as soon as you start talking about, exactly what you would restrict, it becomes really obvious, actually, that a lot of the policies that you could pursue to restrict immigration are going to be damaging to the UK. So a good example of this is what we've already seen in the university sector. The government have made it less attractive for foreign students to come to the UK. And the effect of that is that our universities are really struggling now. So it's bad for British students, because the reality is that our universities became dependent upon having lots of foreign students coming over here and paying much more money for their education compared to British students. And that was beneficial for everybody, because the foreign students were bringing in a lot of money into the local economies, and they were also funding our university sector. So as soon as you start to cut back on that, it's actually bad for the country. But that's what you end up having when you have policies that are responding to numbers and responding to the prevailing political climate, rather than policies that are responding to what actually is needed in the country.
Reform Control Council, this is our commitment. We will use every instrument available to us, and those include things like injunctions, those include things like judicial reviews, those include things like actually enforcing the planning laws, because we think a lot of these changes that are being made are in violation of a number of these laws. And we're going to look at budget reallocation
Your new
as well.
mayor in Greater Lincolnshire, Dame Andrea Jenkins, said asylum seekers should go in tents. Is that now the party policy?
That's what France does. Do you think that's unreasonable?
Is that now the
do you think
party's
that's
policy?
a reason why? Do you think that's a reason why? Do you think that's a reason why people come across the English Channel They risk their lives coming across the English Channel to come to the UK because we're a soft touch, Laura.
But the question here is that now Reform UK's policy? And France does not put all of its migrants or people who are seeking asylum in tents.
But it does put some.
The question is that now the party's policy that's what
It's just morally disgusting, isn't it? Here you've got a multi-millionaire who is saying that people desperately fleeing war and persecution to find refuge in the UK, put them in tents. That's what France does. That's his only justification. That's what France does. Would we put a Ukrainian in a tent, fleeing a war that we actually care about? No, we wouldn't. No, we wouldn't. It's totally morally disgusting. And the only way you can get away with saying something like that is because these people have been systematically dehumanised by the way that our press treats them, including the BBC. You've not had any pushback from Laura Kuenssberg on this point.
want to do is house asylum seekers in tents.
Laura, we held a press conference around 10 days ago when we announced that we will be publishing a plan to deport everybody who is currently in this country illegally in our first term of government. We will publish that plan in the coming weeks and you'll see the full detail.
OK, your brand has been based on accusing the other parties of not keeping the promises that they've made to the electorate. And clearly there's been a lot of public frustration and you've done incredibly well in these elections. But listening to you this morning, you can't yet tell us how much money you think you'll save on the promises that you made during this election. On other things, you're essentially saying, wait and see. You'll look at the levers available or the plan will be coming. Have you actually, as of today, off the back of this victory, got detailed plans to deliver what you've been elected to?
Yeah, absolutely, Tim. This is the other thing people seem to forget. There's all sorts of reasons why the UK has become dependent upon immigration. So this needs to be a nuanced conversation that we have. The right have a point. You can't continue to have hundreds of thousands of people coming into the country without building new towns, without building new infrastructure, without building new schools and new hospitals. I totally accept that. So you have to plan for the levels of migration you're going to have. But Britain also does need migration for a whole variety of reasons, to staff our public services, to help deliver a population that's going to be able to work and improve our economic growth, to pay taxes, all sorts of reasons, and to enrich our society in various ways. And of course, what I've already said, we've got obligations towards refugee communities to provide them with shelter. But we do need to have a sensible conversation about this. And we're not having one really at the moment because all of the parties now really have got an approach where they just want to bring the numbers down, irrespective of what that does to sectors of the economy. I know about the university sector because I've got lots of friends who work in that sector. But arbitrarily cutting down the number of students is damaging that sector. It's really, really clear. And it's actually one of our best exports as the UK is university education. So it seems totally counterproductive to me.
That's literally what we've been working on, right? I mean, the election was a couple of days ago, and we are very confident we'll be able to save a lot of money because we have spent a huge amount of time in the last few months. It's part of why we won the election, Laura. We were very clear. You know, we held that big conference in a big event, 8,000, I think, people turned up in Birmingham to see it, and we went through a huge amount of things that are just objectively wasteful ways that taxpayer money is being spent in these councils. And that is the mandate, Laura, that we have got from voters.
It's not illegal to seek refuge. We're a signatory of the Refugee Convention, so just because statute law has decided that they are that it's illegal to cross the channel in a boat doesn't make it illegal. You've got a right to claim asylum. And the only reason they're crossing by boat is because we made it harder to travel in other ways, and we're continuing to make it harder, which is meaning that people are having to take even more dangerous routes to get here. What we need is safe and legal routes for people to come into the UK.
In overwhelming fashion. So look, we've just won the election. You know, we've got 677 councils. They're electing their leaders as we speak. Our commitment to the people who voted for us and the constituencies, yes, we will save you significant money. Your bins will be collected on time. We will fix your potholes. And there will be a new approach to local government, which will be based around common sense and competence.
OK, well, we will see. It'll be interesting to see what happens. Zia Youssef, good to have you with us in the studio for the first time. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. Well,
Thank God that's done. My blood pressure can return to normal now. Although we've got the Labour Party coming up probably.
Nigel Farage branded this election the beginning of the end for the Conservatives. And we can show you some of the sad faces with those blue rosettes on Thursday night. The party lost more than
I mean, they're basically the same people, aren't they? This is what's so sort of hilarious about this. What quite a lot of these councillors will probably do is take off their blue rosettes come the next election and stick on Reform UK rosettes and get re-elected.
100 councillors and all 16 of the councils that they held going into the vote. The Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, has described the election results as a bloodbath, and she's apologised to councillors who lost their seats on Thursday night and Friday afternoon as the results came in. She's with us in the studio. It's good to have you with us. You've said many times people are cross with what you did when you were in.
So part of the problem with Kemi Badenoch is that most voters don't even know who she is. She's really been absent in terms of, you know, public perception of the Conservative Party, and it isn't helped by the fact that her approach seems to be to define her strategy much closer to the election. She's really going to have to change her tack if she's going to have any chance of surviving as Conservative leader, because the Conservative Party will not wait. I think she's got months before they try and replace her, maybe years, but she's living on borrowed time, and she's not the right leader in my view. I've already made that clear, right? They need to find a leader that's capable of moving to a position politically where they're going to be able to attract a wide base of support, and trying to fight Farage and Reform on the territory they're currently occupying. It's just not going to work.
Government, and that this is a protest vote. How can you be sure that this rejection of the Conservatives isn't permanent? Justin Greening's just told us the Tories are finished.
We have to make sure that it is not. That is what I was elected to do, to renew our party and rebuild trust with the public. But that does take time. And one of the things which I said when I became leader was that the road was going to be bumpy. No party has come back in one term from the sort of defeat that we had. I'm going to do.
I mean, the Labour Party did, apparently, 2019 to 2024. I'm not sure. I'm just not sure it's true. And let me just think about this, because I'm sure there's quite a lot of examples, actually, of parties bouncing back quite quickly.
But the way to do that is by making difficult decisions, thinking very clearly about what policies we're going to bring in, not just making announcements, but having a proper plan.
But in 1998, after the Labour landslide then, the Conservatives actually gained councillor.
I mean, Wilson came back in 74, didn't he, following defeat from Edward Heath in 1970. That's an example. There's probably more.
And by some measures, this is the worst local election results for your party ever. You said Reform's a protest vote. You've also said the Lib Dems are a protest vote, and basically it's going to take time. Isn't it a bit complacent just to say, I need a bit longer, it's going to be tricky? Have you got time to do that?
So in 1998, they were not having elections after an unprecedented high. The elections we had 4 years ago, we did better than we'd ever done before. Even in good times, we would have had a worse result. And I am sorry to all of those councillors who've lost their seat.
But the point here is that the party's performance is
She doesn't sound very sorry, does she?
worse on your watch.
If I could finish the first question. 4 years ago, Keir Starmer had his worst result. He is Prime Minister now, with a landslide majority. We live in politically volatile times. And what I've been saying is that we are going to...
Just to respond to a comment in the chat, I think the reason these local election results are being hyped so much is because they confirm what the polling is telling us. And the polling is unprecedented. It's not been the case in the past that a party that's won a landslide from such a low base, 34%, has fallen off the cliff quite so much. Labour have lost 10 points in the opinion polls in just 10 months. So these local elections are coming at a very historically unprecedented time for the government.
Take the slow and steady way. There will be bumps along, but we can do this, and we will do it in 4 years, not 18 years, 14 years, 13 years, like previous oppositions.
But the point here is that since you have been in charge, the party's performance, both in the national opinion polls and then on Thursday with real life votes, the party's gone down. on your watch. And if you look at other parties, other places in Europe, whether it's France, Italy, Poland, to name just 3 of them, the traditional right-wing party in those countries has been usurped. They've been replaced by others coming along. So are you sure that's not going to happen to you?
Yes, and that is because we are working on a plan. When I came in, I said it was likely to get worse before it got better, and protest is in the air. What we had was Labour saying, all we need to do is get rid of the Conservatives and everything will be better. Things got worse. Now we have Reform saying, all we need to do is get rid of the Conservatives and Labour.
Yeah, I knew it wasn't unprecedented. Just responding to a comment in the chat.
And everything will be better. I suspect things will get worse. But protest is in the air. Yesterday, I had a meeting.
And the thing is about bouncing back in the current climate. Voters are no longer attached to parties in the way that they were. Electoral politics is incredibly volatile. You've seen that all the way around the world, right? So look at the Canadian elections. If you'd been predicting what would happen in that election just a few months ago, you'd have said the Conservatives would sweep into power. And some comments by Donald Trump have catapulted Mark Carney, the Liberal leader, the new Liberal leader, to a victory. Similarly, in Australia, if you'd been predicting it just a few months ago, you probably would have said the Liberals would have done well and the Socialists have got back in. So across the world, electoral politics is very dynamic, very volatile at the moment. That's particularly the case in Britain. We've seen lots of occasions recently where polling has gone haywire. And that means politics is really difficult to predict. But it also means that parties bouncing back, new parties emerging, all of this becomes possible. This is one of the biggest frustrations I have listening to what you might call mainstream political analysis, is that it doesn't factor in that there isn't really a model for the situation that we're living through. We're living in unprecedented times, and all of the assumptions that people bring to politics based upon their experiences of living through the 90s, for example, that's not a helpful way of thinking about politics now, because our politics now is very distinct.
Councillors in Hertfordshire, some who won, and also candidates who lost. And what they said on the doorstep was that people were frustrated with the previous government. I was not leading the previous government. We are going down a new path.
You were in the
yes,
previous
I was,
government.
But they voted for me because of my record in government. I'm one of the people who was trying to fix the things that went wrong. But what they said on the doorsteps, that immigration is still an issue. We try to fix structural problems in our society, aging society, people living longer, not enough people having children. We try to fix all this with immigration. That has not worked. Immigration has now become a problem. We need a party that's going to have credible solutions to fix all that.
But isn't it dangerous to dismiss this incredible result for Reform as just a protest rather than something more serious? I mean, we've had an email in from one of our viewers, Anthony, who said the Tories have been roasted because they stopped being Tories about 14 years ago. And one of your ex-council leaders says, you've not helped. Jason Smithers said that you need to resign. What's your personal responsibility in terms of what's gone on?
What everyone has said, that this is something, as your reader mentioned, that has been 14 years in the making. That's not going to be fixed after 6 months. This is 6 months into a 5-year project. And what we are doing is steadying the ship, being united. A lot of the instability of the past has gone away. But I am not being complacent. I am not dismissive. Reform had a good night. We had a bad night. And what this shows, for a lot of people who hoped that just changing leader again would fix everything, is that that's not going to be enough. We tried that previously, and that brought us to our historic defeat.
But I suppose the question...
I said this at the beginning, the Conservative Party's key strength historically has been their ability to change, and they must do that again. The direction that Kemi's taken the party is not the right one. They need to, in my view, return to a one-nation tradition of conservatism, because what they need to be offering is change that makes a material difference to most ordinary people's lives. And Kemi has got distracted by identity politics. Most people don't care about identity politics. It's a non-starter, really. It can enthuse a section of the electorate, but it's not going to have the mass appeal that is needed to turn out the kinds of numbers of voters that you need to win a general election. To do that, you need to be proposing policies that are going to be making a material difference to people's lives. And if I was advising the Conservative Party, I would say, look at young people and the difficulties they're having getting onto the housing ladder. Conservatives are supposed to believe in private property. They're supposed to believe in independence. They're supposed to believe in personal freedom. You can't have that if you're a young person living in Britain today, because you're saddled by student loan debt and very high marginal tax rates as a result. So there is a Conservative response to all of that, but it's not being offered by the Conservative Party at the moment.
What are you going to do differently? I mean, you got walloped, for want of a finer word. This was a terrible performance for your party.
That is something that we always knew was going to be the case. We said it was always going to be challenging. We said things would get worse before they got better.
Than
but the question you asked, Laura, was what am I going to do? I'm leading from the front. We are going to make sure that we have a credible offer that the public can believe in. We're going to be honest with people about what's wrong with our country and how we fix it, not just with slogans and announcements, not just with easy promises.
I'm not a fan of Penny Mordaunt, I've got to say. She seemed to be really enthusiastically got behind by a lot of people because of her ability to carry a sword at the coronation. Aside from that, I don't really see the appeal.
Because we have a government that did that. What is more astonishing is that less than a year in, after a landslide, Labour had worse results than what it had 4 years ago when people were asking Keir Starmer to resign. We have serious problems in our country that need a serious party.
I just wonder...
We are down.
What are they?
But we are not out. It is my job to make sure that the Conservative Party turns itself around quickly enough.
What do you think that Nigel Farage is getting right?
He is expressing the feeling of frustration that a lot of people around the country are feeling, but he also doesn't have a record in government like the two main parties do. Now he's going to be running some councils. We'll see how that goes.
You've got a terrible record in government. It's probably not a good idea to remind people about your record in government.
But he is expressing a feeling of frustration. That is not my job. My job is to come up with answers and solutions, but also to let people know that we get it. We understand why they were angry with us. We understand why they removed us from office. They're not going to come rushing back just because Labour was bad. They are looking at the two parties as parties that haven't delivered, and I need to come up with a plan that will deliver. Easy announcements and easy slogans are not a plan.
But maybe people agree with Nigel Farage's ideas. Maybe they like the sound of this. And I come back to your suggestion that this is a protest vote. If you rely on calling it a protest vote, the implication is you just think it will go away. You know, a protest vote is a sort of
I
temporary
certainly do
thing.
not believe that. But look at the numbers.
You don't think this will go away?
This was 30%. These things, we look at what's happening all across the world. You talked about France. Look at what's happened in Canada, where a Conservative leader of the opposition, 23 points ahead when I met him in December, lost his seat this week. Same thing happened in Australia yesterday.
So could that happen to you?
So anything can happen. That is why we are not being...
I mean, look, anything can happen. Yeah, but it doesn't just randomly happen. And you've been leader for quite a while. You can't afford to just wait. It's right to be somewhat tentative as leader of the opposition, to not come out with a full policy programme, for example. But you do need to give a broad sense of direction, and you need to be leading an assault on the governing party. And Kemi Badenoch is, you know, for most people, she's just absent from politics. I mean, I'm lucky in that I don't obsess about it quite as much as I used to. That might surprise some people, given that I'm streaming about politics right now. But she's just absent. She's not there. She's not present. She doesn't engage. She doesn't engage people. Most people don't know who she is. The Conservative Party do need to get rid of her, I'm afraid. She's a dud. The Conservative Party are facing an existential crisis. I don't know who they get to replace her, but she doesn't have the right strategy. She never did. The Conservative Party went to their comfort zone. And this is one of the difficulties with the Conservative leadership rules. You narrow it down to two people, and then it goes to the membership. and the membership, if you remember, decided Liz Truss would be a fantastic leader. So perhaps the party should never have gone to those rules, because they're always going to end up with a candidate on the right that doesn't reflect mainstream opinion in the country. But there we go. They need to have a one nation Conservative figure who's going to be able to unite the party, unite the country. Somebody does come to mind. I mean, if you could erase people's memories of Boris Johnson, he'd be a good candidate. But somebody like that, somebody that's got whatever that is, the sort of political it factor that's going to allow them to resonate with the public. It's not Kemi Badenoch, though.
Being complacent. You asked me what I think.
I mean, maybe James Cleverly, but I cannot stand James Cleverly, so it's difficult for me to recommend that man. He'd be better than Kemi Badenoch, yes. But that's a pretty low bar.
Is happening. I've said I do think it is protest, but that doesn't mean we sit back. We are going to come out fighting. We are going to come out with the policies that people want to see. But what we are not going to do is rush out and tell the public things that are not true just so we can win votes. This is not about winning elections. This is about fixing our country. Yes, of course, you need to win elections to do that, but you also need a credible plan. We've seen what happens with Labour. You come in without a plan, just winning, and everything gets worse.
Do you think it's feasible?
I mean, they didn't come in without a plan. They just had a bad plan. The Labour right had a plan. It was to manage the affairs of state better than the Conservative Party, to be more technocratic, to manage the ship of state better. That was their plan, and to promote sort of gradual change. It was never going to be good enough. The left pointed this out at the time, but there we go. They did have a plan. I mean, a lot of their plan involved just smashing the left. That was more of a priority, really, than preparing for government for a lot of them.
That Nigel Farage could be the next Prime Minister?
As I've said, anything is feasible.
that is
Anthony
feasible in your
Anthony
view?
Albanese said, people were writing him off. He's just won a landslide. But my job is to make sure that he does not become Prime Minister, because he does not have the answers to the problems the country.
Yes, Robert Jenrick would be infinitely worse than Badenoch. It would be taking the Conservative Party even more in that direction. And Robert Jenrick is even stupider than Kemi Badenoch is. So, I mean, as a result, he's likely to be elected by the Conservative Party, but he would be a bad choice as well, yes.
Is facing. How do we increase productivity? What is the plan to improve our environment while dealing with climate change? How do we make sure that we can deal with an ageing society, people not having enough children? Immigration, a big...
I mean, I don't think there is anybody, right? Because the difficulty the Tories have is that the reason that Farage is doing well is because the Tory brand is trashed, in part because they're an establishment party. So you can't pick somebody like Jeremy Hunt, for example, that people are suggesting in the chat, because he's an establishment figure who was a big part of the last government. So you need to find somebody who is able to project something very, very new that, I don't know what that looks like. I don't know the Conservative backbenchers well enough to be able to suggest somebody. But it can't be somebody from the last government. It can't be somebody that's just going to bang on about culture wars and is going to move the party to the right. It's got to be somebody serious from the younger ranks of the party, who's not a complete nutcase, as most of them are, because most of them are part of the Boris Johnson intakes of Brexit nutters.
issue. His answer is to have another minister. We have two ministers who are dealing with that. Those are not serious solutions.
Do you think people
We will
should have
come up
more
with that.
children?
I do, but that's a personal choice. But we have to look at the demographics of our country. We cannot solve it with immigration. It is making things worse. It's making us all poorer, and none of the problems are being fixed.
OK, Kemi Badenoch, thanks so much for coming in. It's been a very busy and tiring days for everyone who works in...
Oh, Christ, is it West Streeting next? I'm not sure I can cope. Deep breath. It's West Streeting. Are we all ready?
Politics, so we're grateful to you for being with us this Sunday morning. Well, it was tricky for the Conservatives.
I mean, the thing about West Streeting is, if the Labour Party, if the Labour right do decide that Starmer's leadership has been ineffective, this is the guy they're going to turn to. And that'll be exactly the wrong thing to do. But let's hear him out.
It was very, very tricky, but it wasn't a much prettier picture for the Labour government. They lost the Runcorn and Helmsby by-election. There's the victorious Reform new...
Just a random person in chat attacking Harold Wilson. Now you're going to have to provide a little bit more than that for me to be able to respond.
MP alongside a grinning Nigel Farage there. There was only 6 votes in it, but it had been a rock-solid Labour seat. And they lost councillors, a far cry from July. You've probably heard Keir Starmer's new mantra now. The government will go further and faster to get things done. But is that going to be enough to cheer voters back up? Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, is with us. Thanks so much for coming in. Let's start, because we love hearing from our viewers. Let's start with a question from Philip, who says this about Keir Starmer. What he fails to see or is not willing to admit is that the local election results show people are not happy with the changes he's making, changes that were not in his general election manifesto. Do you admit that lots of voters just don't like what you've done in office?
Well, there's no doubt, you know, and I campaigned in a by-election in my own patch in Runcorn, across the country.
In his own patch, he almost lost his seat at the last election. Okay? He's not a popular guy in his patch.
There's no doubt that there are some...
Okay. Abortion is genocide, according to somebody in the chat. Lovely.
Individual things that we've done that people have not liked. What I would say in defence of those decisions is we knew at the time...
It's lovely to have such a wide variety of political opinion represented by the community that comes to my videos.
To be honest, every single measure we've taken to raise more money for the National Health Service, for example, has not been popular and has been contested. But the reason we've done that is because people wouldn't thank us if we left the NHS rotting in the crisis that we inherited. Thanks to those decisions, we've seen NHS waiting lists fall 6 months on the trot. The 2 million more appointments we promised in our first year, we delivered 7 months early, already over 3 million. But I also understand why, if I'm sure it's happening right now as we speak, as I'm on the telly saying waiting lists are falling, there'll be people shouting at the telly saying, hang on a minute, I'm still waiting. And both of those things are true. Waiting lists are falling. There are still 7 million cases on the waiting list. So I understand why, whether we're talking about waiting lists, whether we're talking about interest rates falling 3 times, whether we're talking about wages finally going up above inflation, people won't necessarily be feeling the change yet.
A lot of this stuff, I'm pretty sure, has nothing to do with the Labour Party at the moment. The Conservative Party, when they were in office, really wanted to bring down waiting lists. It didn't quite happen whilst they were in power, but they did put in a lot of money and resource and time and effort into trying to get that to happen. It's almost a product of the fact that actually waiting lists had already peaked. You had waiting lists pretty close to the highest they'd ever been. I said this at the time when Labour came out with their pledge cards. One of the pledges was bring waiting lists down. And I said at the time, well, it's going to be difficult to not achieve that because waiting lists are already so high. They've got to come down, right? Because there's only so many ill people the population can have at any given moment on these waiting lists. So I'm not sure how much credit we should give the Labour Party for getting waiting lists down from their historic highs. They have put money into the service. But I'm not sure there's anything they've done in the last 10 months that really can account for waiting lists falling.
And we know, the Prime Minister knows this, that's why he's talked about the need to make progress further and faster, that unless people feel this country has changed and changed for the better at the next general election, people will look for change elsewhere. We know that.
People are.
Right, okay, good. I'm glad you know that because currently you're not doing enough to deliver.
Feeling some of the changes that you've made, changes you didn't tell them about in your manifesto in the election campaign. People are feeling the difference from winter fuel allowance being taken away from millions of pensioners. Businesses are feeling the difference having to pay more national insurance for their staff. There are changes you've made that you didn't warn people about that people don't like. And telling people again and again you're going to go further and faster with things that they don't want, is that really going to cut it?
Well, it's the outcomes people want to see. They want to see safer streets. They want to see stronger, more secure borders. They want to see waiting lists falling. They want to see the cost of living improving. Those things do take time. And you don't turn around a country with the range, the breadth, the depth of crises we inherited, you don't turn that around in just 9 months. So all I'd say to people, we've got the message, we're not daft, we haven't got...
Well, I don't think they have got the message, really. The Labour Party did this a lot, explaining to the public what actually they want. The message that Labour should have got from the local elections is, we don't like you very much. We don't want you at the moment, and we don't want the Tories. There's a great deal of apathy, right? That really we're fed up of the whole political class. That's the sort of general sense that there's a general sense that nothing's working, and that we're really fed up of politicians in general telling us what we should think or how we should feel. So there's something that irks me about the way that Wes is talking about this. The Labour Party need to take a little bit more responsibility here for failing to give a narrative of change. It's not our fault for not understanding it. They need to tell us where we're going to be in 4 years' time and how we're going to get there, because they've fundamentally failed to do that. And instead what they've done is implement unpopular policies, and they've also failed to listen to us when we said to them very clearly, we don't like these policies, we'd like you to reverse them. They've been tin-eared in the face of those objections. It's not good enough.
Heads in the sand. All I'd ask people for is to give us a bit of time and to give us the benefit of the doubt, to recognise the range, the breadth, the depth of the crisis that we walked into. We're going at those challenges as hard as we can, as fast as we can. We're as frustrated and impatient about the challenges and the change that's needed in the country as everyone else.
But people's frustration isn't necessarily about the challenges that you faced on getting into office. People's frustration are with the decisions.
Well, part of the reason they can't do anything about it is that they've constrained themselves with arbitrary fiscal rules. So, you know, yeah, it's frustrating that they can't go faster and further, but part of the reason they can't is because they've chosen to constrain themselves politically by promising too little at the general election, and economically by imposing arbitrary fiscal rules. So the constraints on the Labour Party are self-imposed constraints, which are in part the product of the Labour Party being scared of its own shadow and being frightened of the right-wing press, too frightened of political consequences to actually do what is needed to fix the country. They're doing nowhere near enough. They're doing nowhere near enough. They know that. We know that. And that's why we're frustrated, because we can see the public realm falling apart, and we know that the Labour programme is not going to deliver enough. It might make modest improvements, but we can see all around us that modest improvements, you know, it's not going to be good enough. It's not going to be good enough to improve the situation as much as it needs to be improved, because there's been decades of underinvestment. So, yeah, the frustration, you know, you're getting a bit of frustration from me. Usually it's calm political analysis from me, but I am genuinely frustrated that the government are not doing enough to deal with the scale of the challenge. And this is politically where the frustration and the rise in reform comes from.
You have made. So I'll just ask you again, telling people again and again, Keir Starmer says it, you've just said it, minister after minister after minister says, we have to go further and faster. That's a slogan that suggests to people that you're just not listening to them, actually. You're going to do more of the same, more of the things that they don't like.
No, on the contrary. The Chancellor's been very clear with the Cabinet and with the country that we can't just kind of keep reaching for the tax lever to solve our problems. We've got to do more on the reform side, making sure money's...
Yeah, the level of scrutiny and critique of Labour is higher, always is, particularly if you're a left-wing leader of the Labour Party. I think the media gave Starmer a free pass, actually, for a lot of the time whilst he was leader of the opposition. But eventually you're going to run into a constraint caused by the fact that we do have a right-wing media ecosystem in this country still. But it is still right to hold this government to account. They are timid in the face of the challenges that we face. I think a lot of the media commentariat thought that Labour would pivot in office and be more bold, and they've been proven wrong. And And that's partly where this comes from.
Better spent. That's why, although the Chancellor has invested £26 billion more in the NHS, made possible because of those choices, not all of which have been popular, but I would argue as Health Secretary, the right choice to invest in the NHS. I'm also going hard at the layers of bureaucracy in the NHS to make sure the money that's already going in, as well as new money, goes as far as it possibly can. That will happen.
Right, but you could have been honest with the electorate prior to the election that you were going to increase taxes. Instead, what you said was, we're not going to put up your taxes. And then after the election, you claimed that you'd suddenly discovered a black hole in the public finances and that it required taxes to go up. That was dishonest. And this is why people are annoyed, because you did the usual politician's trick of really assuming that we're all idiots and that we won't remember what you said to us. I just think the degree of cynicism that politicians have towards the electorate, it's just not going to work in this in the current political environment. We're not stupid. We pay attention. We heard Keir Starmer when he was campaigning for the leadership, when he said that he'd be really radical. We heard that. We watched him go back on that. We heard Labour, when they were campaigning for the general election, tell us our taxes wouldn't go up, and then they did. We're not stupid. I think part of what people want is politicians to be honest. And again, it comes back to this: the appeal of Farage is that people look at him and think, yeah, at least he's being honest. So even when he's attacked for saying that the NHS should be turned into a sort of market system, I think people grudgingly like that, actually, in a way, because at least he's saying what he thinks. And you don't get that from politicians like Wes Streeting.
Having real impact on the front line, and that's true for my colleagues right across government.
I just wonder, though, after 9 months, nearly 10 months in office, you are a not so new government anymore. You're not babes in the wood who've just arrived. Is there anything, as we were asking Kemi Badenoch the same question, is there anything that you look back now and think, oh yeah, maybe we should have done that differently? I mean, I just wonder, maybe you shouldn't have spent so long when you moved into Downing Street as a party telling people how dreadful things were. Maybe people are gloomy because you told them to be gloomy.
I just think honesty is the best policy, and we
Absolutely correct. It was such a stupid thing to do, for that narrative of an incoming government to be, we're going to have to make lots of difficult decisions, because it just focuses attention on those decisions. It was so stupid. It was painfully stupid. An incoming Labour government needs to be talking entirely, exclusively, constantly about change, about what they're going to do differently.
Came in, we knew the country was in a state. That's why people chose change. We'd prosecuted that argument in opposition. There were some things that we walked into that were genuinely even worse than we feared. When I walked into my department, for example, the Department for Health and Social Care, I was told that instead of delivering 40,000 more appointments a week, which was in our manifesto, the first step we promised, that I'd have to instruct the NHS to deliver 20,000 fewer appointments every week because the money wasn't there. Our predecessors had spent money that wasn't in the Treasury, and we could have just gone, oh, well, that's...
When Cameron and Osborne came into office, they provided a political narrative about what they were doing and why they were doing it. Now, that happened to align with what the press was saying, right? But this is partly why there is a difference. It's not the entire reason. But Cameron and Osborne said, we're going to have to make cuts to get the deficit down over the Parliament because this position that we find ourselves is economically unsustainable. That was their argument. They put an argument to us, and lots of people accepted that argument. I didn't, but lots of people did. What is the Labour Party's argument? What are they saying to us? I don't know what their argument is. What is their fundamental claim? What do they claim is wrong? And what are they going to do to fix it? This is what I mean when I say there isn't a political narrative. They don't have one. And that is a fundamental problem. And it is why they're being attacked, because people don't understand what they're about. They can't understand what they're about because they haven't told us. All they've said is the Tories were bad and we've come in to fix the mess. That's it. And it's just not good enough. You have to do better than that when you're piecing together a political narrative.
game and gone to the country and said, oh, I'm sorry, we've broken our first step on the NHS. The Chancellor and I didn't do that. We made a different choice to invest in the NHS in year, as well as the new financial year, which has only just started.
Raise people's taxes to do it, but that was your choice.
Whether it's those
you're
taxes
explaining your choice.
or the things that were in the manifesto, like the private school VAT, going after non-DOMs, asking the wealthiest to pay more. Those things have been contested too. These things, raising money is never popular. But what I hear from our opponents is a lot of criticising how we raise the money, at the same time as often saying we should be spending even more. You've got to make choices. We've made those choices. And I hope and believe that over the course of this Parliament, as people not just see the improvements in the numbers, but feel the improvements in their lives, that people will think, OK, the change we voted for is happening. I'm just asking people to give us time, give us the benefit of the doubt.
But again, this is only going to work. This idea. So it harks back to Mrs. Thatcher, right? Thatcher comes in 79 and the medicine is tough. She basically says, look, we're going to fix the inflation crisis that we have, and we're going to do that with this thing called monetarism. It's going to be painful. The medicine is going to hurt, but it's going to bring inflation down. And when she's challenged about this, she says the lady's not for turning. There's a clear narrative there. And then when inflation comes down and Thatcherism has created a set of economic winners and economic losers, by the time the 83 election comes around, she wins re-election with a landslide, partly because the Labour Party splits. But there's a narrative there, right? So you can only benefit from material conditions changing if you give an argument in advance. If you say, look, this is what we're trying to achieve. This is the vision we have of Britain in 5 years' time. And they've fundamentally failed to do that. They haven't provided at any point a clear narrative of what Starmer is about, what this Labour government is about, what they're trying to achieve, what difference they're trying to make to our lives. So, yeah, look, it could work. After all, if polling stays as it is, they've only got to get back up to about 30% of the vote to win a landslide or to win a majority. So it's not that big a task, and things clearly could improve. But they've got to do better on the narrative.
That turning around a country with the breadth and depth of the crisis we have does take time.
You say you are listening to the public. Was your colleague Lucy Powell listening?
I mean, they haven't even explained what the crisis is either. So they haven't. It's so frustrating because they haven't even explained what the Tories got wrong. You know, what caused the crisis? What caused the crisis? What is it? What you know, you've got to analyse the problem. You've got to say what went wrong. And the reason they can't, by the way, is because they don't want to take a Corbynite position, because they're so wedded to the idea that the left have never got the right answers, because the obvious thing to say is austerity was wrong. That's the reason why we've had massive underinvestment and why the public realm is suffering today. And that would be the right answer. It was made worse by the pandemic, but fundamentally the problems we face are a product of austerity. But the Labour right can't bring themselves to say that, because that would mean that they'd be agreeing with the left, who they systematically crushed. So that's why they don't have an analysis. It's also why they don't have a solution to the crisis, because they, above all else, the Labour right will never acknowledge that the left of the Labour Party are right about anything.
To the public, when she said about grooming gangs that have appalled many people, she said it was a dog whistle when a Reform activist expressed concern about it. Does that look like she was listening to people who are terrified about that whole saga?
Well, Lucy's apologised for those comments, and it's right that she's apologised. What I would say, and I've been in plenty of those debate formats myself, sometimes in the heat of the debate, you say something that comes across badly, that you wish you hadn't said.
She's a member of the cabinet.
Yeah, but she's also human, and I've made mistakes in the past. I'm sure I'm going to make mistakes in the future. She's mortified, and she does not want and would not want people who've campaigned on or been victims of these most appalling crimes to think she was in any way trying to undermine those experiences or those arguments. I think the point she was trying to make, and the point I would make, is on such a serious issue, the more we can take the heat of the politics out of this and get to the heart of the challenge, the better. That's why, since we've come in, we've asked every police force in the land to look again at all of those cases that were marked no further action.
But everyone knows that there's going to be no national inquiry. But just as we've got you, when it comes to your job as Health Secretary, there's an important debate going on around public sector pay. Now, some doctors are balloting again for strike action. Nurses said no to 5% last year. The Royal College of Nurses is currently surveying their members about what they want to do about pay. You spent a lot of taxpayers' money trying to end strikes last year. Are you going to do that again, or are strikes a real possibility?
Well, what I'd say to resident doctors who are currently...
So the situation here is that the government, I think they said something like, was it 2.8% they said they'd give? I can't remember the exact number, but the pay is recommended by an independent body. So these independent bodies were set up to recommend a pay figure. So I know in education, the rumour is that they're going to recommend 4%, which is way above what the government say they can afford. And the difficulty with that is if you don't follow the recommendation, that it's bound to lead to strike action. And the government is saying there's no more money. So, yeah, it's highly likely there's going to be public sector strikes as a result of how these things are decided.
Balloting is they'll see and receive in the coming weeks the recommendation of the pay review body. So I'd urge them to kind of wait and see the figure that's recommended and how government takes that forward, same as the rest of the NHS workforce. I do understand, and I've got a lot of sympathy with the arguments that are being made, particularly by the lower paid members of the NHS workforce. Whether you're a recent, relatively recent graduate, as many resident doctors are, often in their 20s and 30s, struggling with the cost of living. If you're a nurse, you're often, looking at every month the money that's coming in, but also the bills that are stacking up and having to make some really difficult decisions. So we do want to make sure that people are paid fairly. That's why the Chancellor, within days of coming into office, acted to implement all of the recommendations of the pay review body.
Yeah, as if that was the reason. we It's funny, isn't it? Because this is how stupid they think we are. They think we're going to buy that line, right? The reason they paid off the unions. Do I need to finish the sentence? Yeah. They paid off the unions because they didn't want strikes. That was it. Right? It was a political decision because they didn't want strikes immediately on becoming a Labour government. They probably still don't want strikes. The unions will have a lot of leverage here because they probably thought they'd be in a stronger position after a year. That maybe they'll have implemented some stuff and that their popularity would be increasing, or at least they'd be in a honeymoon period, that their polling would have improved, because that's what's supposed to happen. So they're actually in a very weak position to be facing down strikes if that's what's about to happen.
His last year, and also gave me the mandate to resolve the resident doctors' strike. So I think I'd say to people at the moment, judge us on our record here. We came in within days. We dealt with.
Yeah, you got to, again. This is a product of austerity, right? So for I think almost a decade, it might have even been longer, public sector pay was zero. It was capped. It was totally held down. So as a consequence of this, public sector pay fell behind. It went well below inflation. So this is people really wanting their standard of living to be where it would have been had all of that not happened. So these are perfectly reasonable demands. And where workers are unionised and they've got leverage, then I will always support them, just to make my position absolutely clear, particularly in circumstances where like in education, where there's a recruitment and retention crisis. We can't recruit enough teachers, particularly in certain subjects. And obviously the real effect of that is that people's education, children's education, suffers.
Those public sector pay issues. We resolve the resident doctor strikes. I want to work with NHS staff, not just on pay, but also on the...
Everybody used to have good pensions in the past. It was, this is the race to the bottom argument, isn't it? if we were all in strong unions and we were all fighting in the public sector and in the private sector to defend our terms and conditions, then we wouldn't have crappy pensions in the private sector. So I don't think we should be entertaining those arguments. We should be fighting for good pensions and good pay for everybody. And that means joining unions, and it means fighting and bargaining with our employer for better wages and better terms and conditions, and not doing down workers who do have strong unions for fighting to maintain or improve their terms and conditions of employment, because we're all working people. We all benefit from a society where workers are strong and where they're able to bargain for better terms and conditions. So I know that isn't always recognised, and you often have this narrative about union bosses, and what have you, but the reality is we all benefit when unions are strong.
Wider terms and conditions
Okay, well,
and the experiences they're working in.
Okay, I suspect that's a conversation we'll probably come back to. Very briefly, a big story this morning, an important story. We're hearing that police have arrested 8 men across the country in separate investigations into counter-terror plots. Is there anything that you can tell us about that?
Just to say, firstly, thank you to police and the security services for the work that they are doing in these cases and do on a daily basis. It is work that is often unseen, where success goes untrumpeted, because the nature of those investigations, it is often highly secret and highly sensitive. We'll obviously keep the public updated as we can. Given these are live investigations, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment further, but it is a moment just to remind everyone that every single day these people are saving lives, and without the naming, the praising, the credit that other people get in other walks of life, so we're very lucky to have them.
OK, Health Secretary Wes Streeting here for the Labour Party this morning. Thank you very much indeed for coming into the studio this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, of course, we always want to know what you think. We've had some of your questions for our politicians this morning. You can keep them coming in. The email address is there. If you're social media minded, you can use the hashtag BBC Laura Kay, and the WhatsApp number is there as well, 08000 282 161. Let's talk straight away then to the leader of the Unison Union, Christina McAnee, somebody very important in the Labour movement. You said there needed to be a reset. You heard Wes Streeting there.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think that Wes would be a better leader of the Labour Party, and they are mistaken. They are mistaken.
What did you think of what he had to say? Doesn't sound like much of a reset on the way.
Well, I hope that there will be, and actually, I think Wes is doing a pretty good job as the Secretary of State for Health. I think one of the problems we've got at the moment in the Labour Party is that everybody's talking about all the mistakes they've made, and they have definitely made mistakes, but we're not really talking up or hearing about all the other things that they've done. So, certainly from my perspective and our union's perspective, we've got an employment rights bill going through Parliament at the moment.
I mean, this is exactly why the Labour Party are doing this stuff, because they need Unison to come on the BBC and talk up these things. It's pretty much the one thing that the unions have got at the Labour Party. And the reason, again, I know I've got to be cynical, right? The reason Labour did it is to buy the unions off. It's the same reason why they implemented the public sector pay rises. The Employment Rights Bill, as you're about to hear, is a very good piece of legislation. It's going to strengthen worker protections. Currently in the UK, if you're within the first 2 years of employment, an employer can literally call you into the office and sack you for pretty much any reason whatsoever, and there's no recourse. You don't have the right to claim unfair dismissal. The Employment Rights Bill does away with that and means that employers can only dismiss you within the first 9 months of employment for a specific reason, and they have to follow a particular process. It basically has to be to do with your competence to do the job, which makes sense. It also strengthens collective bargaining rights, gets rid of some restrictions on strike action, allows for online balloting in industrial disputes, and allows trade unions to access workplaces, as well as getting rid of things like fire and rehire, or heavily restricting the use of fire and rehire anyway. So it is a good bill, but the purpose of it is political, right? It's to buy the unions off, so that they won't criticise the Labour Party further down the road.
Which is, the biggest shift to work in workers' rights for over 70 years. It's going to get rid of 0 hours contracts. It's going to end fire and rehire. It's going to give sick pay rights from day one. It will give us a fair pay agreement in the care sector. all things that the country's crying out for and that people desperately need.
It's almost like she knew what I would say, so she'd cover all the things I missed.
We've seen what they've done in Scunthorpe on
With
British Steel. You know, waiting lists are coming down. There's, you know, last year we got above inflation pay settlement.
Yeah, I work for a trade union. That's the reason I know. The first question we ask somebody when they ring us up is, how long have you been employed? And if they say less than a year, it's really difficult because you've got no right to unfair dismissal. So if you want to Google this, just to demonstrate that I'm right, if you Google unfair dismissal ACAS and read what it says, it'll say within the first 2 years of employment, you basically lack employment rights almost entirely. This was something that David Cameron brought in. And thankfully, the Employment Rights Bill will get rid of that.
It's in parts of the public sector, particularly in the NHS. So these are all the good things that need to be talked about, because certainly most of the media won't be reporting on those things because most of the media is not particularly Labour friendly. So the party has to talk about it, the government needs to be talking about it, and as do others. But that doesn't take away from the fact that there's major problems. So, you know, Wes spoke about pay at the moment in the NHS. NHS workers were due to get their pay increase on the 1st of April. And yet again, we're waiting. So people don't know what they'll get. We've been asking for them to get rid of the pay review body and just go into proper negotiations that we've got in Scotland. And that actually does come up with better results.
Justine Greening, when you heard Zia Youssef talking about what reform...
I actually think that if they had proper negotiation and they didn't have this pay review body, they'd be in less trouble with the unions at the moment. Because the issue that they've got at the moment is the peer review bodies are going to recommend a figure well above inflation, and that's going to cause industrial unrest, quite rightly.
Going to do. There was quite a lot of "we'll get back to you, we'll let you know." What did you make of what he had to say about their plans or lack of detail in their plans?
I felt like they were insubstantial versus the promises they'd be making to people. I thought it was worrying that, having made such a big deal about waste, I think everyone would agree that we need to cut waste out of any tier of government, including local government, that in a sense there wasn't any idea as to how much there was to go at. You know, I think you've got to wish anyone who's coming in to lead a local council well. We want well-run local council.
I think I might skip ahead to the Green Party coming on, so let me do that. Let's move all the way through here. So we should have... Oh no, we've got Ed Davey. Let's listen to a little bit of Ed Davey. Let's miss out all the fluff here and go straight to Ed Davey.
Sir Ed Davey joins me now. Good morning to you, Sir Ed. You're claiming now to be the party of Middle England.
Good morning.
Good morning. But your share of
He's so nice, isn't he, Ed Davey?
the vote didn't move in a meaningful way. With the Tories in free fall and the government unpopular, shouldn't you have been absolutely hoovering up in terms of the overall share of the vote?
Oh, we had a fantastic night, Laura. You know, for the first time ever, winning a majority in Oxfordshire, in Cambridgeshire and Shropshire, becoming the largest party and almost winning in Devon and Wiltshire and Gloucestershire and Hertfordshire. So, yeah, we were very pleased with our results. And
very unexpected that Ed Davey should be leading the Lib Dems to their best ever results. They're likely to do even better at the next election, I think. The Lib Dems are very strong in the south of England, and they're a massive threat to the Conservative Party down there.
you know, we're now the second party in local government, overtaken the Conservatives, and I think we're on track to overtake the Conservatives at the next general election. So either whichever way you look at it, it was great results for the Liberal Democrats.
You're in almost, I think, the leafiest place I've ever seen. I mean, you're very obviously targeting leafy Middle England. But does that mean you've, you know, slightly given up on other parts of the country? Because in days gone by, the Lib Dems campaigning machine might have gone gangbusters in Runcorn in that by-election, for example. There are other pockets of more urban areas where you might have gone very, very strongly. But now you're branding yourself so overtly as Middle England. What about the rest of the country?
I think Middle England is the rest of the country, it's the whole country. It's the vast majority of people who want common sense, practical, centrist politics and policies to fix the things that need fixing, whether it's potholes or social care. And, you know, we are now the official opposition in County Durham. It was the Conservatives and Labour losing seats to reform there. We actually gained seats, and we're going to hold reform to account. We had great results in Hull and East Yorkshire. Didn't quite get.
That's an incredible situation for Labour in Durham. I didn't even realise that. This is the, you know, Durham that hosts the mining gala every year, and Reform are leading the council and the Lib Dems the official opposition. Absolutely bonkers that is the case. I mean, I don't understand the appeal of the Lib Dems, obviously, because I'm on the left. The idea that, you know, you'd be voting for centrism at the current moment, I don't get it. But they're popular within a certain section of the population.
The line there, but really good result, brilliant team performance. And in the next year's local elections, in many of those northern cities, I really expect us to do well. And actually, it was in the south where Reform got beaten. It was Liberal Democrats holding back Reform in places like Buck.
I actually think something that is underpriced is that Reform do well in the north of England, the Lib Dems do well in the south, Labour do well in the urban areas, and then you end up with a Labour-Lib Dem coalition government with very few Conservatives and with Reform as the official opposition. I think that's kind of a reasonably likely scenario. So I don't see the Lib Dems becoming the official opposition, but I could see them potentially coming into government with Labour as one way of keeping them in office. But, you know, we're 4 years out, so who knows?
For example. And so I'm really proud, and I think this is a massive step forward for the Liberal Democrats. I think our community politics, our focus on the issues that matter to people is coming through. And, you know, I'm proud it's the Liberal Democrats taking on Reform, and I think it can work if we show that their support for people like Donald Trump and Elon Musk actually isn't very popular. Look what Mark Carney did.
I really wish he'd done up his shirt, because that's all I could look at. I did not need to know that Ed Davey had that much of a hairy chest. It's literally all I could look at.
In Canada, defeating a hard right opponent by standing up for patriotism for Canada. Anthony Albanese in Australia defeating a hard right candidate, another person who liked Trump. And I think if we can expose the fact that Nigel Farage is so keen on Donald Trump, that will mean that Liberal Democrats come through. I've been very disappointed in the way that Labour and Conservatives have almost copied Reform and moved towards Reform. I think we should call them out for what they stand for.
Nigel Farage, though, interestingly, once said he took his inspiration from the Liberal Democrats with your local branches, local councils, local progress. If he's taken inspiration from you, doesn't sound like it, but I'll try my luck. Would you take any inspiration from him?
Listen, he clearly doesn't share our values. I don't share his. And, you know, I think what's going to happen now they've actually got to run.
The thing about the Lib Dems is you kind of understand their appeal, right? They're appealing to centrist dads across the country. It makes sense. They know who they are. They know who they're appealing to. And I think circling back to both Labour and the Conservatives, I think there's a real problem in that they don't know who their base is anymore. The Labour Party have really distanced themselves from their base. Their base is supposed to be people like me, progressive activists on the left, and then they're supposed to reach out beyond that base. But they've actively tried to alienate their base of support by attacking the left. And the Conservatives similarly don't really seem to know who they're trying to appeal to at the moment. So I think that's the one thing that the Liberal Democrats have over the other, what do we call them, legacy parties.
Councils who will see what they do. You know, in the election, Nigel Farage said they should cut funding for special education needs and disabled children and young people. I think families across the country will be really worried by that. When polls closed, he said he wanted to ape Donald Trump and Elon Musk's policies in town halls. And look at some of the other policies. If he's really going to do what he says, presumably he's going to stop insulation programs that keep people's energy bills down and keep people's homes warm. If he does what he says on climate change, so I think we'll hold him to account. Laura, and I'm very confident that people will increasingly see that it's only the Liberal Democrats taking on this divisive populist politics. And I just urge your viewers to Google "Let's join the Liberal Democrats" and come and join us.
I think
both in our
the election
success in
campaign
community
is
politics
over.
and taking on reform.
I think the election campaign
If it's only the Lib Dems taking on reform, we are doomed.
is over, but of course you're encouraging people to back your party, but the campaign is over. But interesting to hear your perspective on what happened. Thank you very much indeed for joining us as ever this morning. And we should say, all this talk of English councils, in Wales and Scotland there are big important elections next year, and then in Northern Ireland elections in 2027. So that's why the focus this time round has been on what's happened in England. Because
Yeah, and apologies from me too. I don't talk enough about Scotland or Wales. I know that I don't, but I live in England, so
that's where the elections were this time round. And of course, there was another competitor who gained some seats, the Green Party. They did make some progress, but their share of the vote, according to our national projection, actually went slightly down. I spoke to their co-leader, Adrian Ramsey, and asked him why.
What we saw in this election was an 8th year in a row where we've left the election with record numbers of Green councillors. So we took some big strides forward right across the country, as we've done over each of the last 7 years. And that's regardless of the wider political circumstances. And you look at how well Reform have done in this election, but actually their success is not built on strong foundations. Many of their people have been elected without having strong roots in their local communities. It remains to be seen whether they'll be willing to put in the hard.
I mean, look, I'm a member of the Green Party. I said this in the last stream. Adrian Ramsey's not good, is he? He's like a wannabe school prefect. He's got to go. He's got to go. Really, the Green Party need better leadership than this. They've got to be a little bit more scrappy, a bit more rugged, a bit more like, they're supposed to be an anti-establishment party, and Adrian Ramsey projects as if he's been in politics the last 20 years, right in the mainstream. Yeah, I'll definitely be following the Senedd elections. I think Reform are going to do really well, unfortunately, and I think that's going to be potentially the final nail in the coffin for the Labour Party. The Greens have obviously done really well by campaigning locally and winning seats at the last election. They won 4 seats, best they've ever done, most councillors they've ever done. So I don't want to be too critical, but I do think that the Green Party need to get better leadership.
Yards. Green councillors have a strong track record in our communities. People know what we stand for, fighting to protect local services, defend our environment, get more affordable housing, whereas I'm now deeply worried about where we're left with Reform.
I mean, part of the problem is, sorry to cut him off, it's not like he's saying anything interesting. Part of the problem with the Green Party is they also don't know who their core voter is. There's they're kind of divided, right? So you've got 2 ways that they could go, and I think they've got to choose. Personally, they could go after the kind of constituency that Adrian Ramsey has, which is a large sort of formerly Tory constituency. I think that is not the way they should go, because I think where they're going to be strongest is challenging the Labour Party in urban areas as the Labour Party vote falls away. I just don't think they can afford to ride 2 horses as a party. Obviously, they've got to try and find a way of broadening their appeal. But they've also got to know who their base is. So I think there's a real problem for the Green Party with working out who their base is. And frankly, I think their base is quite a lot of people like me. People who quite liked Jeremy Corbyn. People who are a bit younger. I mean, I'm 40, but in terms of British politics, I guess I'm quite young. You only really start to get old in terms of the voting data when you get above like 55 or whatever. But yeah, they need to work out what they're about a bit more. They're not coherent at the moment, in my view.
arguing for cuts to local councils that are already severely overstretched, people unable to get places in special educational needs for their...
Yeah, Lee is hoping to stand for the... What did you say you were hoping to stand for the Senedd? Best of luck with that. Hopefully you get a seat.
Children, we're seeing public transport decimated.
They're using STV at the next election, so it's going to be interesting for that reason as well, because formerly the Senedd used AMS, where you've got constituency elections and list elections. They're now going to be moving towards STV, which is going to mean that it's going to be a much more proportional result. So the Green Party should do better in those circumstances. So yeah, hopefully the Greens do well there.
Around the country, and nationally we're seeing our NHS overstretched, so we need to be ready to take the argument to reform.
But the question remains, I mean, as you've just said, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the two big parties, but in these elections people went much more convincingly to reform. And
oh, thank you for that. They're using modified d'Hondt. Modified d'Hondt. Yeah, so that sounds like a party list system. Are they... It used to be STV. It didn't used to be STV. It used to be AMS, I'm sure. Hang on, let me put my password in. It definitely used to be AMS, right? So they used to have these. It used to be partly first past the post, partly d'Hondt. My understanding was they were moving towards pure STV. I'll have a look in a second on my phone.
Indeed to your other rivals, the Lib Dems, than they did to the Greens. So why aren't you able to capitalise on the public unhappiness in the same way that Reform and the Lib Dems have been?
Well, we have made big strides forward in these elections. Of course, I want to go further. And John Curtis has highlighted, as many commentators have done, that we now have an era of 5-party politics in England, 6 parties in Wales, people increasingly thinking about where they're going to go. And this is a time when the Green Party's growing, and I'm ambitious for what that next stage looks like for the party. I want us to take another big step forward. And I'd say to people looking around, looking at the fact that this Labour government has come in, is cutting funding in real terms to the NHS, to funding for local councils and other frontline services, is removing the winter fuel allowance, is removing the support, crucial support from some of the most ill and disabled people in society.
All right, okay, yeah. So they're going to use a closed proportional list system. So it sounds like it's going to be the d'Hondt method essentially. So a closed party list is where the party decides the rank order of candidates, and they use something called the d'Hondt method, which I'm not going to try and explain, to make the result proportional. It used to be that you used to have some of the seats elected using first past the post and then d'Hondt to top up the results and make them more proportional. So moving to pure d'Hondt should make the overall result more proportional, and the key thing for the Green Party is it should help them in the next election.
If you want a different approach, if you want a livable future, a fairer future where we support the most vulnerable, invest in our public services, then do what so many other people are doing, do what record numbers of people are doing, and join the Green Party. Be part of our movement for a fairer future, for saying we can fund the NHS if we ask the very richest in society to pay a bit more. We can have a livable future where we take the climate action that Reform is trying to stop and make sure that we do have a livable future for our children and grandchildren, and do it in a way where we support the most vulnerable people in society.
Well, as I was saying before, I thought the election campaign was over, but there we are, Adrian Ramsey from the Greens. Now time for something different.
Yeah, we're definitely not going to be watching that. So I'm going to move to just be on the screen for a second. I don't know how long. Oh, getting a bit uncomfortable in this chair, and I need a drink of water. So I'm probably going to end the stream soon. Yeah, best of luck, Lee, with standing for office. It's a very bold thing to do. I don't know if it's something I will do at some point in my life, but yeah, best of luck to you with that. As I say, with the Welsh elections, I think the key thing about the Welsh elections and all of the elections next time around is that the Labour Party are going to continue to do badly. Bear with me. So that's going to continue to put pressure on Starmer. I personally think if nothing changes, the position of Starmer within the Labour Party is going to get worse. The and that's going to mean that MPs are going to start to worry about the safety of their seats. So even though he's packed the party with loyalists, I still think when you get to the next electoral cycle and Labour potentially lose Wales, something that should seem impossible because they've held Wales ever since the Welsh Parliament was created, it's got to put pressure on Starmer, and I think there's got to come a point where Labour MPs decide that a leadership challenge has to happen to try and bring somebody in time for the next election. So I suspect it's going to start to get very difficult for Starmer in the next electoral cycle. So I give him about a year to turn things around, and I don't think he will, because all of the advice he's getting is from the Labour right. It's from Morgan McSweeney. He doesn't really understand what the problem is. That faction of the party misanalyzes what happened at the last election. They think they got this great landslide. They think they got this big mandate for change, and they didn't. Most important fact about the last election is it was the lowest percentage of the vote that has ever produced a majority. So this was not a Labour Party coming to power with a big, strong mandate. This was a Labour Party coming to power in circumstances where they were seen as the default alternative to the Tories, right? And it's really important to understand that, because it helps to explain why Labour's support has dissipated so quickly. Okay. Yeah, they are, yeah, but I just think they're going to go down with the ship, but we will see. I've not looked at the polling for the Welsh elections very recently. Everything I've heard is that Reform could well do very well in the Welsh elections and might well be able to replace Labour, but that's just based upon what I've heard. I've not looked at the polling in any degree of detail. Right, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for joining me this evening. It's only the second, it's actually the third time, but it's only the second time I've really streamed. I'm going to try and probably do this once or twice a week moving forward. So do join me when I do. Anyway, goodbye for now.